everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again. Today I'm reviewing James by Percival Everett, which recently won the National Book Award, and it's enjoying quite a lot of popularity in the UK too. I've seen it crop up in the Best of 2024 list from quite a few of my local bookshops. I must confess, I didn't know Everett before reading James, although I'd seen a couple of his books around. I'd seen Erasure and The Trees, and I'll definitely be reading those next very soon, which should already give away that I was quite intrigued by James, and I found it quite an engaging, quite a stimulating read. James follows in the long tradition of works of fiction that engage with classic literature and offer a bit of a rewriting of a classic novel from the point of view of maybe a minor character in the original novel, or at least a character whose perspective was perhaps not represented in the most complete and most fair of ways, again, in the original classic work. The most famous book in this tradition is probably White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which is written from the perspective of the mad woman in the attic in Jane Eyre. James is, in some ways, a rewriting of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn told from the perspective of Jim, the escaped slave in the novel who travels with Huck down the Mississippi throughout the American South. I was curious to read James, but I must say that maybe the most snobbish side of me was also wondering as I approached the book whether this was going to be the kind of book where when you get into it, you already kind of know what to expect. It's almost as if you've already read the book, you already know what you're going to get. And I was just being snobbish for no reason, because James is quite a surprising book. It was definitely not entirely what I was expecting, partly because that definition that I gave, the idea that this is just a rewriting of Huckleberry Finn, is extremely reductive and has nothing to do with, I would argue, the core and the atmosphere and the broader meaning of the book. As a novel that engages with a work of classic literature, James, by all means, does justice to Huckleberry Finn, to such a looming work in the American canon, mostly because it does justice to its strangeness. Huckleberry Finn is quite a weird novel. It changes in tone, it changes in atmosphere a few times throughout its length, and it's a book that can be at times incredibly silly, almost annoyingly silly, and at other times it can pack a real emotional punch, especially in its descriptions of gratuitous violence, of the horrible things that people do to each other, often for the most menial of reasons. And that absurdity is definitely captured in James, and because that is inevitably the absurdity of a society, of a world based on slavery, where people treat each other like animals. The deep, terrible ways in which this type of living affect the lives, the behavior of the slaves and of the slavers are explored widely in all their absurdity, in all their inhumanity and cruelty in James. The plot, especially in its first half, follows closely the key plot points, if you will, from Huckleberry Finn, and this book definitely explores how utterly annoying and insufferable Tom Sawyer is. Tom Sawyer is absolutely unbearable as a character in Huckleberry Finn, and you get a certain degree of annoyance at that little brat in James too. That said, especially in its second half, James departs quite significantly from the original material in a way that's very interesting, packs a couple of really surprising plot twists, one major plot twist especially, and that makes it a very engaging, very entertaining book. I think inevitably you're going to appreciate it more if you've read Huckleberry Finn, but I wouldn't necessarily think you have to have read the original to appreciate this. It stands on its own legs. The other point on which James sets itself apart from the original material is that this is actually a book that presents Jim not just as a simple man who had the horrible misfortune of being born in a situation as monstrous as being a slave. He actually is a man with a deep and complex inner life. He's actually a bit of a scholar. He is a teacher to the other slaves on the estate where he is. He has to work as a slave, and he is a reader. He engages with the works of Voltaire, of Rousseau, with a lot of Enlightenment thinkers and thinkers, great philosophers who engaged themselves on the topic of slavery, but inevitably did it so from the perspective of wealthy, privileged white Europeans who very often, in their opinions of slavery, came across as, even while supposedly progressive and enlightened, as actually quite monstrous themselves, and sharing some of the thought patterns that also made the slavers the monsters that they were. I think an interesting point, and I would be very curious to hear what you thought, is whether this aspect of James' personality gives the book a certain degree of unreality, or whether it doesn't. I'm thinking here of a comparison with another brilliant novel about the horrors of slavery, which is Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad is very much, I would call it a realist novel, except that there's a fantastical element in it. The Underground Railroad is not just a metaphor. It's not just a metaphor for this web of people who were trying to help the slaves escape from the southern United States to the northern states. In that novel, the railroad is an actual train running underground and taking slaves to liberty. I'm not sure whether something similar is happening here, where you have James as this sort of philosopher, enlightened slave, teaching the other slaves the importance of using slave speech, using the lingo and the dialects that the slaves were used to employ in the eyes of the master as a way of confusing the masters, appeasing them, keeping them complacent. I'm not sure whether all of this is believable, realistic, or not. I laugh because admittedly this is a completely sterile question. It's just a sheer matter of genre. Is this a fantastical novel? Is it a realist novel? Ultimately, who cares? But I guess it is a stimulating question. To me, it's not the fact that James can't be an intelligent person. That's never in question. It's just that his learning and his loquacity, if you will, are perhaps hard to believe in a person who never had the benefits of an education, who had to live as a slave all his life. But then, is it unrealistic? Can you develop that type of education just by stealing a glance at a book, stealing a read at a book here and there when you're able? I'm not sure I have an answer. It's why I'm curious to hear what you thought, whether you found James and the school he sets up in the slave camp to be realistic or not. And as I said, it doesn't particularly matter. It was just an element of the book that fascinated me and made me quite curious. I was especially curious about it, I will add, because the novel makes fun ever so slightly of certain slave narratives, this genre from the 19th century, from the era of the great debate in the US about abolitionism, because some of the slaves, the freed slaves in these narratives, supposedly remember their origins and the kingly dynasties back in Africa to which they belonged before they were sold into slavery. And I found it weird that James would criticize the lack of likelihood in those narratives when his own narrative is possibly slightly far-fetched. But then, is it far-fetched? Who's to say? Perhaps James, a bit like Huckleberry Finn, is just a book whose plot is quite turbulent, just like the waters of the Mississippi. It's entwined and complicated and keeps turning and changing in unexpected ways. And James' life, at many points in the novel, changes in tragic and occasionally in lucky and beautiful ways, as he is able to find a modicum of friendliness, a modicum of connection with others, even in the hellish reality in which he is immersed. In this sense, James, make no mistakes, is a utterly devastating book. It's as agonizing and as difficult as any book about slavery cannot help but be, but it does shine through with a beautiful light in a few places, and ends on a note of strange anger, but a brilliant and beautiful and redeeming anger, which feels especially appropriate to the world of today, and might be why the book is so popular, why it seems to have been received quite warmly by people. The idea that anger can be a beautiful thing and can be used to change the most hellish aspects of the world and fight against them. More than with most books, this is one where I'm curious to sit on it for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month or two, see how I feel about it maybe in a year's time, what parts of it will stay with me, what parts of it will resonate with me. I must confess I did find that at times it moved a little bit too fast almost, especially toward the end. The resolution of James' story felt maybe not rushed, but definitely very swift. And it felt as if the book could have taken more meat around some aspects, some of its bones, some aspects of its maybe subplots or its philosophical conversations, its development of Jane's psychological character. But at the same time, this leanness makes it a very fast, very engaging read. It's definitely gripping. I dare you take more than a couple of days to read it just because it's so engaging. I was very taken with it. I'll definitely read The Trees probably next, maybe Erasure by Everett too. And I look forward to hearing what you thought of James especially and of Everett's others novels. I know that he's written dozens upon dozens of books, so there's definitely lots to explore. Thank you as always for watching the review. I really appreciate it. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel, and bye everybody.